Again, in this session we'll be going back to the compassion wing of practice. And the compassion wing of practice at the foundation level are these 4 immeasurables. The first of those that we looked at was loving kindness, in Sanskrit Maitri, in Pali Metta. So remember, loving kindness is the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. Immeasurable loving kindness is the wish for all living beings to have happiness and its causes. The second quality we looked at yesterday was compassion. Compassion in Sanskrit and Pali is karuna, and compassion was the aspirational wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. So immeasurable compassion is the wish for all living beings to be free of suffering and its causes. So we saw in both of those that it's recommended that we cultivate these in stages. That first, in the text, it talks about cultivating loving kindness and compassion to our friends because it's most easy. Then expanding that out to include people we don't know very well. Once we're comfortable with that, expanding out to the difficult people, so-called enemy, and then eventually expanding out to all living beings. But as I mentioned, I think in our modern society we need to add one more step to that process that normally you won't see in the text, and that is at the very beginning to cultivate loving kindness and compassion for ourselves first. Because if we're not kind and compassionate to ourselves, then we won't be able to expand that out to others. And what we saw, of course, in both loving kindness and compassion is they are aspirations, they're a wish. They're not emotions as often they are looked at in English language. Love and compassion usually are seen as emotions. But here, of course, when we talk about love or loving kindness and compassion, they are this aspirational wish for ourselves and others to have happiness causes and be free of suffering and its causes. And with loving kindness, we also looked there at how to distinguish that from attachment. That attachment, also how it's understood or defined in Buddhism, was this mental factor that sees its object as attractive, it exaggerates the object's attractiveness, and then wishes to possess and hold the object. Why? Because it believes that it's a source of our happiness. So it's important that we distinguish love or loving kindness from attachment, because usually they're mixed together, and attachment is interfering with our relationships with our love or loving kindness. So we need to distinguish them, because in a relationship, of course, love or loving kindness is about simply wishing that person to be happy, whereas attachment's all about me, and it's wishing that person to make us happy. So it's really, attachment's all about me, 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 and it really even just sees the other person as an object or thing to satisfy me. So to distinguish them, to increase the loving kindness as much as possible, decrease the attachment as much as possible. And to also there appreciate that attachment is pervasive in our life, meaning that we won't be able to get rid of it by next week. In fact, in Buddhism, this world we live in is often called the desire realm. And it's called that because desire, craving, attachment is our main driving force in our life. In fact, even to the point where often in some Theravada traditions, rather than saying ignorance, our distorted view of reality, is the root of our suffering, in some of the Theravada traditions they actually say craving, attachment is the root of our suffering. Because in a practical, experiential point of view, that is the driving force that leads to suffering in our life. And then with the compassion, we also looked at anger. That anger, again, as it's defined in Buddhism, is this mental factor that sees its object as unattractive, it exaggerates the object's unattractiveness, and then wishes to harm the object. So remember then, when we use the word anger in Buddhism, there's this intention to harm. So we need to have very clear our understanding of these words, particular attachment and anger, as they're used in Buddhism. Because these two words, I think, in other spheres, in psychology and so forth, have defined a little bit different, I think. So we need to understand that, otherwise we may get confused. And we also looked yesterday at one of the main reasons that we actually get angry with others who behave badly, particularly who try to harm us. And we looked there at this idea of cognitive fusion, that we often identify ourselves and others with our behaviours. So rather than having the correct perspective of seeing and acknowledging there is a person who's behaving badly, or I am behaving badly, we tend to fuse those two things together, the person and the behaviour, and see them as a bad person or me as a bad person. And then, of course, if we do that cognitive fusion, then usually that leads to reactions. Because generally, if there's bad behaviour, we want to reject that bad behaviour. But if we fuse the behaviour to the person, that rejection ends up as rejecting the person. So therefore we get angry at the person, we get angry at ourselves, we beat ourselves up. And therefore it's very difficult to have compassion as long as we fuse ourselves to, or others to, the negative behaviour. Because then it seems like compassion is accepting that negative behaviour. Of course, we should not tolerate negative behaviour, but that's what it feels like with compassion if we do the fusion. So if we avoid that cognitive fusion and simply see, and distinguish person from behaviour, then instead of reacting with anger, we can respond with compassion, and at the same time not tolerate that negative behaviour. So those are the first of the two of the four immeasurables. What I'd like to do today is look at the second two of those four immeasurables. But before I do that, is there any still any questions about loving kindness or compassion, dealing with attachment or dealing with anger?
Yeah, well, a little story and then I'll have the question. I have a very good friend and we travel together in my car. And I parked the car not very good and I asked him to park it nicely. So he went into the car and he bumped it into my car and another person's car. And okay, that was okay. It wasn't okay, but it happened. He's left. And then he said, "Well, I will participate in the paying of the damage." What do you mean you participate? You have to pay for it. I said, "But it's your car." Now the question is, how do I differentiate the person? I like him very much. But whenever I think about it, I just want to throw him to hell. How do I differentiate? What does it mean not to be? You say not to be exploited or something like?
Yeah. So I think the question really there is, when we're faced with difficult situations, how can we best respond in our own interests and the other person's interests as well? And I think here again is we need to make sure there's wisdom together with compassion. Because if we don't have that wisdom there with the compassion, then that compassion can be blind and can end up not responding in a good way, or even allowing that person to take advantage of us. And of course, in these sorts of difficult situations, there is no book that you can go to that says, do this. So all we can do is evaluate the situation as best we can, using wisdom and compassion, and then respond. So in your particular case, then, you know, our wisdom says, well, I think the reasonable thing is that they damaged the car and they were maybe not paying attention, so then maybe they should pay for that. But again, and of course that other person may not agree with that, of course, but if we do the cognitive fusion, allow anger to get into that, then I think the situation, the likelihood of some acceptable result will be much less than if we try to work with compassion. And we can be quite strong in our response with compassion, because otherwise what can happen is that if it's a very difficult situation and we don't, and if it calls for it to have a strong response, not again hatred, if we don't do that, then often people can try to take advantage of that. And of course, if we allow people to take advantage of that, that's not compassion, because we are in some way contributing to their bad behaviour, their bad habits. So therefore, we don't tolerate that if people are trying to take advantage of us. So again, there's no, for these difficult situations, they're difficult because there's no easy solution. But I think if we do that, we have the best chance of some solution that is acceptable to both parties.
The main thing I feel is that it's very difficult for me to think about it without getting angry. So, okay, let's calm this down, and then I can have wisdom. But
yeah, what we can, exactly. And so the thing we need to remember, of course, is that we now tend to be very much in reaction mode. You know, something pleasant comes, react with attachment. Something unpleasant, aversion. So that tends to be our strong habit. So here, of course, we're trying to change that habit. And again, not to have unrealistic expectations that somehow, just knowing this, somehow we won't react with anger when some strong stimulus comes. Of course we will, because that's our strong habit. But at least now we have some framework here to start to perhaps see things in a different perspective, so that we can now start to respond in a more constructive way than reacting in an unhealthy way. And of course, what you will notice is that once we start to do this, it'll be small stimulus that comes that we'll be able to be quiet and calm and respond. And then over time, even stronger stimulus will be able to stay calm and not react. But this will take time. It'll take time.
May I ask about mind meditation?
About?
Question about mind meditation?
The one from this morning?
Yeah.
Well, that would be better probably to leave to next session. So next session we'll talk all about that.
I have a question about anger. I have a tendency to get angry at people, but it's not because of a bad behavior, just a certain kind of behavior.
Right.
So then I have some aversion against the anger, and I'm really in a loop.
Right. Sometimes when we get angry or irritated by other people's behaviour, which is not actually maybe that harmful, sometimes it's actually something that we do that we're sort of suppressing. And what often happens is that that person's behaviour is mirroring something in us that we don't like to acknowledge. So it's sort of in our face. And it's something we're trying to sort of not acknowledge about ourselves. Particularly if it's the case that this person's behaviour irritates you but doesn't seem to irritate anyone else. This is often a very sure sign that check is that what they're doing, is that something that actually we do that we're not really acknowledging about ourselves. And often this is the case. So just check that and see. But again, if we can avoid the cognitive fusion, at least we won't get angry at that person. At least that. But often in this sort of case, it's like that, I think. It's something that we are not acknowledging about ourselves. So just check that. Could be interesting.
My question is about language of compassion.
The language of compassion. Yeah.
Yesterday you told me that in the case of strong emotions, you can use compassion.
That.
When a strong emotion appears,
right.
and it is something usually related to a pain, otherwise it wouldn't be so strong. And if it is something under a level of not conscious experience. So for me it's like how you would talk to a child. You can't just say, I wish you would be happy, I wish you would not suffer. It's not enough.
Right, so I'm not sure what the question exactly is. What's your question? How do you apply compassion? How do you apply compassion in difficult situations?
Yes, when it is still not clear.
Yeah. Of course, as I mentioned yesterday, I think, is that when we're faced with difficult situations, then the initial thing we are to do is to be what's called patient, means to remain calm. So to help with that, we need mindfulness, because now we have quite a strong habit of some sort of stimulus comes and we react immediately based on our habit. So generally we tend to react to pleasant stimulus with attachment, unpleasant stimulus with aversion, anger, frustration, and so forth. So we're wanting to change that. And to change that, we need, one of the key elements of that is we need to improve our mindfulness. And through the Shamatha practice, we're going to do that. Because in Shamatha, that's the main tool. We're strengthening mindfulness. So by strengthening mindfulness, then we'll be able to use that little window of opportunity between when the stimulus comes till when we normally react. There's a little period of time there. It may only be a few seconds, but with mindfulness we can catch that period. We can catch between when the stimulus appears and when we react. And then we're in control, we're mindful, we're present. We can see clearly what's going on, and we can see the start of a reaction, whether it's craving, irritation, jealousy, or anger. And then we're still in control. And then what we can do, of course, is just observe that reaction. And that's what we're doing a little bit in today's practice, of course, is just observe that arise and pass without following it. So then we can not react, and then we can use wisdom and compassion to respond to that difficult situation. Again, not doing the cognitive fusion, and see that situation clearly and respond using those two elements of wisdom and compassion as best we can. But is there a particular case that you're interested in, a particular...
When I was talking, I was thinking that this practice, what I found that a word is grounding. I was looking for practice for grounding.
Grounding.
How you can apply mindfulness when the body, all the nervous system is...
Yeah, so that's where, and that's what mindfulness will give us. It will give us that grounding, because with mindfulness, our mind will be more calm, more clear, more focused. That whatever shamatha practice we're doing, you'll find that in general, you'll be much more grounded, because your mind will be not so agitated. It'll be more calm, more clear, and more focused. So that's going to help us very much with grounding ourselves. And as I think quoted the other day to Shantideva, he said, those with a distracted mind are caught in the jaws of the mental afflictions, which mean if our mind is very distracted, we're predisposed to reacting with mental afflictions. Where if we have a more focused, clear mind, the mind is generally more calm. And we sort of know this from our own experience, that when our mind is much more calm, it takes a lot more stimulus for us to react. But if our mind is already a little bit agitated, some little stimulus comes and whoosh, big reaction. So you'll find that this shamatha practice, together with working on mindfulness through the day, will give us a new default mode in daily life. And that default mode will be a much more calm, more clear, and more focused mind. And so that's going to be very helpful for when we're faced with difficult situations. We'll be in a much better state when that difficult situation arises.
So yesterday I realized that I have an aversion of studying to exams. It makes me stressful and I don't want to do it. And in the exam period, I tried to do a meditation each morning and I really couldn't sit, I had all the thoughts, I need to do this, I need to do this, I need to do this, and I couldn't concentrate on anything. And only the aversion got really stronger because of that. And so I feel like I'm stuck when I'm in stressful days, like when the meditation doesn't work. I don't know.
Yeah, so the question is...
So how to deal with these kind of things?
To deal with...
Stressful...
Yeah. So again, I think sort of often that stress, we're more predisposed to stress if our mind is distracted and agitated. So again, I think you'll find that one of the side benefits with the shamatha practice, and of course this is not going to happen after meditating 2 or 3 times, but it'll take time, but you'll find that with the mind being more calm and clear, it'll be less likely that you get caught up in agitation and stress. So it'll take much more to cause stress. And in the case of doing exams or something, again, I think with that sort of thing, of course we may have some aversion to that, but understanding that aversion is just making things more difficult. And I think it's important to see, maybe it's like a difficult situation, a difficult exam or something. If we can see difficult situations in our life not as some sort of problem or obstacle, but actually see them as an opportunity. They're difficult, but it's opportunity. Because actually, if we look at our life, the times, I think, when we most developed as a person is not when things were going easy and well, we just sort of float along and nothing happens. It's only when we're faced with some difficulty that challenges us that we actually develop as a person. So if we can shift our perspective and see difficult situations not as some sort of problem or obstacle, but as an opportunity, I think, 1, you won't develop aversion, and 2, you won't have all this stress, but you'll enthusiastically try and work through that difficulty, because you'll see that this is a challenge. If you see it as a challenge that we can develop as a person, then there won't be that stress, because we'll want to engage in that challenge to develop as a person. So that's going to be, I think, helpful. Okay, let's go on to the 3rd and 4th of the 4 immeasurables. The 3rd is empathetic joy, or mudita in Sanskrit and Pali. And empathetic joy is a rejoicing in our own and others' virtue and good fortune. And I think this is also particularly important in our modern world, because in our modern world we tend to have this obsessive focus on the negative. And not only do we have this obsessive focus on the negative, but we tend to do that with cognitive fusion. So, of course, then to avoid the cognitive fusion on the negative, but then we need to have balanced view. We need to also focus on the good things in life. For example, I saw a study they did recently. I can't remember where it was done, but basically they interviewed people and asked them about their perspective of, I think it was like the last 5 or 10 years, what their perspective is. And the general response was that things are getting much worse. More crime, more danger, more everything, very bad. Everything's getting worse. Where this study was taking place, statistically, things were getting much better. It was safer, less crime, less robbery, less murders, and so forth. So statistics showed decrease, people's perception was increase. And I think it's because the media is just pushing out negativity and bad news. And so that's what we see. And to quote a modern-day philosopher, William James, he says, what we attend to becomes our reality. So if we're always attending to negative, that becomes our reality, even though statistically it may be not that. That's what we see, that's what we experience. So I think it's important to have a balanced view of ourselves and others, and that is to focus also on the positive things that we do and others do. But again, as we saw yesterday, not with cognitive fusion. Not to praise people, but praise their behaviour. Not to praise ourselves, but praise our behaviour. And so this empathetic joy is this rejoicing in our own and others' virtue and good fortune. So that is the third. And then the fourth is equanimity, in Sanskrit upeksha, in Pali upekha. And this is, equanimity is a impartial, unbiased view towards everyone. Now we tend to be very biased and partial. And what we tend to do is we tend to categorize people into 3 groups simply from the perspective of how they affect us. Those people around us who seem to support me in my happiness, we label friend. Those people around us who don't seem to affect me in my happiness anyway, we label stranger. Those people around us who seem to interfere with me in my happiness and even seem to cause me suffering, we label the so-called enemy. So we tend to categorize people into these 3 groups simply from the perspective of how they're affecting us. And then, of course, once we do that, we end up with attachment to friends because they seem to be the source of our happiness. And then we often end up with apathy and indifference to strangers because they don't seem to affect us in any way. So I couldn't care less what happens to them. And then to the group we've labelled enemy, we often end up, of course, aversion, hostility, anger, hatred, because they seem to even be causing me suffering. So we end up with attachment to friends, apathy to strangers, hostility, anger, hatred to the difficult people. And so equanimity is about overcoming that biased view. And one way we can begin to do that, of course, is to understand we are all equal in wanting to be happy, wanting to be free of suffering. That in this respect we are all equal. That my happiness is no more important than the happiness of anyone else. We're all equal in wanting to be happy, wanting to be free of suffering.